We're joined now by White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Sarah, good morning. Good to be with you. Well, the president seems downright elated, maybe even relieved. He said America is a great country at the White House yesterday. He's in a position now to publicly support, maybe even authorize, the release of this underlying Mueller report. Will he do so?
I think that the president is doing exactly what he should, and that's leaving that decision into the hands of the attorney general, and we'll see what decision he makes on that front.
Well, last week he said, let it come out. And of course, there was a bipartisan vote in the House to release publicly the Mueller report itself. So he's already on the record. So does he or does he not support the public release of this?
Look, I don't think the president has any problem with it. He has been the most transparent, accessible president we've seen in modern history. This is a person who loves to engage with the media, takes questions day in, day out. He's more than happy for any of this stuff to come out because he knows exactly what did and what didn't happen. And now, frankly, the rest of America knows. They know there was no collusion. They know there was no obstruction. And it's a complete and total exoneration of the president.
If that's the case, is he willing to, for example, waive any claim of executive privilege so that, again, this could be made public?
I'm not going to get into the weeds on executive privilege. That's a determination, again, that the Attorney General and White House counsel's office would have to make because they do want to protect individual Americans, and they also want to protect the office of the presidency. This is something, frankly, that should never have happened. This is a 2-year waste of taxpayer time and dollars. They spent over $25 million on this just to find out that there was nothing there. This should never happen to another president, and we want to make sure that the institution of the president is protected.
Let's be clear about what this report, what this letter is and what it isn't. It is an exoneration, a legal exoneration with regard to conspiracy or collusion. As to this issue of whether the president obstructed justice in this investigation, the special counsel doesn't say, and in fact makes a point to say this report does not conclude the president committed a crime. It also does not exonerate him. So would you acknowledge it is incorrect for the president to call this a total exoneration?
Not at all. It is. It is a complete and total exoneration, and here's why. Because the special counsel, they said they couldn't make a decision one way or the other. The way the process works is then they leave that up to the Attorney General. The Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General went through and based their decision on Mueller's investigation. This wasn't based on just their own ideas and their own thinking. It was based on Mueller's investigation.
In point of fact, you have a special counsel because the person is supposed to be independent and supposed to make this legal judgment. In this case, for whatever reason, Mueller didn't. Attorney General Barr took it upon himself to issue a legal conclusion. And some critics are saying, wait a minute, is this on the level? He did it in 48 hours, and he wrote a memo 8 months ago, in June last year, stating there wasn't an obstruction of justice case. So the criticism is, here's a guy making a snap judgment who had already made up his mind about the case, and it's on the record.
It's not a snap judgment. This is anybody that knows Attorney General Barr, including a number of Democrats who have known him for decades and have talked about what a great individual he is and how highly respected he is in the legal community. He takes his job seriously, but let's be clear. It wasn't that he took this upon himself. That's the process of the law. When the special counsel couldn't make a decision, couldn't make a final determination, they refer that to the Attorney General to make that decision. He made it in conjunction with the Deputy Attorney General, who's been intimately involved in this process from the very beginning. So it's not like you have somebody that just showed up onto the scene making this a silo.
What about the idea that he already had judged the case? I mean, he wrote a 19-page memo stating there's no obstruction case against the president before he saw one piece of evidence.
Look, I think that it is very clear. Look at Bob Mueller's report. He could not make a determination. In the legal community, when you can't convict somebody on something, you're exonerating them, legally exonerating them.
You're not
pushing them on something.
You're not. I mean, to say, just as a legal matter, to say that you can't prosecute someone because they don't meet the elements of the statute is not. It's not an exoneration.
Well, and they couldn't make a decision. I think the big takeaway here is that there was nothing to show conclusively that the president obstructed justice. They couldn't make a final decision. They followed the legal process. They referred it to the Attorney General, who consulted with the Deputy Attorney General, who had not been, had no memo and had been intimately involved from the beginning. And together they made that decision.
It is a legal clean bill of health. This letter says there's not going to be charges against the president. Okay, on both of these
also not forget, when there is no crime and there is no collusion, it's very hard to obstruct something when there wasn't a crime.
Well, that's a technical legal argument that may or may not have guided the decision making here. Let me ask you this. For the last 2 years, the president has absolutely eviscerated Bob Mueller, a lifelong public servant, a former Marine, a registered Republican, I might add. He's called him a national disgrace, discredited, a prosecutor gone rogue who oversaw a gang of thugs. In the end, this individual conducted an investigation, came to a conclusion that ultimately cleared, as we just discussed, the president. Did Robert Mueller deserve better from the president than this kind of language and behavior?
Frankly, I think the American people deserved better. They didn't deserve for the election of this president to try to be taken down.
Wait a minute, but the president's rhetoric about a public servant doing a job.
Are you kidding? The president's rhetoric matches. They are literally, the media and Democrats have called the president an agent of a foreign government.
Wait,
but that is an accusation equal to treason, which is punishable by death in this country.
Well, wait a minute.
I mean, that is...
You have kids, and you know that if you say, did you do this? The answer isn't, yeah, but my brother did that. So let's talk about the president's behavior. He called Robert Mueller. He trashed him for 2 years. And in the end, Mueller just did an investigation that ultimately the president considers a total exoneration of him. Does he owe Robert Mueller an apology for that kind of rhetoric?
I think Democrats and the liberal media owe the president and they owe the American people an apology. They wasted 2 years and created a massive disruption and distraction from things that that impact everyone's day-to-day life. I mean, let's not forget, this took place under the Obama administration. You had people like Clapper and Brennan lying to Congress to perpetuate this idea of Russia collusion against the president of the United States.
I think they're talking about the fact that Russia did, in fact, meddle in our elections, which is borne out by this latest report and the intelligence agencies of the U.S.
And they tried to tie the president of the United States to it, which was completely false and completely wrong.
I think that was the subject of the investigation, which we now have the results of. And they are very clear. It says no collusion. Sarah,
I think it's a shame for the American people, but we're all very glad. I think it's over and we can move forward and focus on things that really matter.
Well, on that collusion issue, it was as clear as it could be. Sarah, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it.